My name is Alexandria Brown. I'm the research librarian at Napa County Historical Society. I am a Black Napan, lived here most of my life. And I'm going to talk to you very briefly. If I talk too fast, please just wave me down. I'm going to talk very briefly about Napa's Black history. So I'm the librarian at Napa County Historical Society, Master's in Library and Information Science with a specialty in Archives and Records Management, long. I also have a master's in U.S. history, and I wrote my thesis on African American history in Napa County. And that means that I went page by page through a couple hundred to a couple thousand documents and newspapers and clippings and photos and books, and research, and compiled a complete and extensive census record list of every African American who lived in Napa and was recorded on the U.S. Census from 1852 to 1940. I then analyzed that data and figured out the socioeconomic status, what they were doing, where they were. I discovered, a Black Renaissance in Napa, and I also discovered several of the earliest Black Napans. So when do you think, besides we obviously can see the Black Bear flag, but when do you think the first real group of African Americans came to Napa County? Anybody have a guess?
1800s. 1700s.
Actually, if you count Black Esteban, who was Esteban the Moor, he was one of the first African into the United States and crash landed about Galveston, Texas in the early 1700s. But the first African Americans in Napa County, hello Talia Shock, I don't know who that is. The first Black pioneers in the Napa County, the first one was actually a man named Anderson Norris. He was in here about the 1820s, 1830s. Jumped ship in Sausalito off of a sloop. Sorry, this is really being a weird feedback. He jumped ship around Sausalito and then escaped all the way up to Calistoga, where he hid out and became a hunter, and he was very well respected amongst the, thank you, that's much better, amongst the people living up north, including the Fowlers and a man named Ezekiel Merritt. And the reason you need to know the name Ezekiel Merritt is because Salvador Vallejo captured Anderson Norris, and because he jumped ship, that made it treason, and Anderson Norris was executed by Salvador Vallejo against the wishes of Ezekiel Merritt. A few years later, Ezekiel Merritt joined several of the other several bear flaggers, including these 8 Black bear flaggers who nobody talks about. And they all, of course, rounded up the Vallejos and shoved them into prison and took over California as part of the United States. So there's a little bit of a grudge there. But, as I said, the Black bear flaggers, everybody knows Nathan Coons and the Fowlers and all of the white guys, and depending on what side of the story you're on, they were either heroic American heroes who busted into the fort and imprisoned a bunch of Spanish people, or, more likely, they were a bunch of drunken hooligans who busted into a house in the middle of the night, arrested a guy who was on their side, and then threw him in jail. But there were also 8 Black men who participated in the Bear Flag Revolt, including a man named John Grider, who's here on the right. He's the only man we have a photograph of. He's also the only man that I can find any information on. The rest of these men all sort of disappear. The problem is John Grider was the only one who was able to get his freedom. He eventually worked in the gold field and was able to buy his freedom for himself and his mother. The rest of these men, as far as I can tell, remained slaves. So we had slavery in the Bear Flag Revolt. Always an interesting change. So, according to the U.S. Census in 1852, the state census in 1852, these are the first African Americans in Napa County. All of them, with the exception of John Edwards, right there from Ohio, all the rest of them are slaves. It does not say that they're slaves. It says they have independent professions. In some cases, they even live outside of white households, but they are slaves. So you may remember Missouri Compromise that kind of threw off a lot of the balance of race in the United States. Well, one of the things that held up California's entry into the United States was the issue of slavery, whether California was going to be a free state or a slave state. Eventually we become a free state, so because you can't have slaves in a free state, what do? Well, you bring your slaves in anyways, you just don't call them slaves. So what happened in Gold Country in particular is they bring them in and stash the slaves out in the mountains where the census takers couldn't find them, which is why there are no African Americans in Napa County recorded in 1850. I know they're here, but they're not recorded because they were stashed away from the census takers. The other thing that you would do is just before you had to free your slaves on whatever 3-year or 7-year term you decided to bring them in as laborers, you just pack them back up and ship them back to the south and drop them back off and brought in a new group. So that was very common. So as you can see here, there is no way that Negro Billy or Negro Girl C or a girl whose name is misspelled so much that I can't quite tell, so I've just called her Sanity, there's no way that they are free people. The only one I know that is free, and you can tell, is John Edwards because he was born in the North. He was born in a free state. The rest of these were all born in slave states or border states. They will eventually become free, or at least William Chapman and Abraham Sewell will become free later on. I'm not sure about the rest of them. But as a side note, William Chapman, there's a property up just at the very bottom of Lake Berryessa, the very southern point, in an area called Negro Canyon. And that Negro was William Chapman, I'm about 99% sure. All right, so after the Civil War, we have sort of a brief influx of African Americans into Napa County. And this is sort of the start of the 1860s, 1870s really, and then into the 1880s. Is what I call Napa's Black Renaissance. This was our Harlem Renaissance period. This is the influx of African Americans. We have a couple hundred African Americans living in Napa County, most of them in Napa City or within a 10-mile limit. In the 1870s and 1880s, we actually had 10 black farmers living within 10 miles. And they all had very large farms outside of Napa County and ran cattle and grew wheat and things like that. And they were very successful farms. However, they couldn't hire any black labor. They couldn't get African Americans to come up and work the fields. And that's part of why we had this big downfall. But during this period, we have Edward Hatton, who becomes an agent for for 2 of the black newspapers that we had in the North Bay, the Pacific Appeal and the Elevator. And these are advertisements out of the Napa Register for their businesses. Edward Hatton ran a restaurant and was also a barber. Frederick A. Sparrow was a barber as well. We very much had the barber thing locked down here in the black community. Frederick A. Sparrow was also the first African American in Napa County to register to vote when the amendment was finally passed. And that caused quite a kerfuffle. There were some people who were not too happy about that, about African Americans being allowed to vote, but he signed up anyways, and eventually we had about 38 African American men who were eligible to vote, and all of them did register. There's an interesting story about most of the African American men at the time, of course, voted Republican, because at the time the Republican Party was very different than the Republican Party we have today. All of them voted for Republican, with the exception of one man who voted Democrat. And apparently the other Republican black men were not too happy about that and beat him up in the street over it. It's kind of an interesting time. We also had, so during this period in the 1870s, we have a colored school. We also have a colored church. So the colored church kind of was a spawn off of the Methodist church. And then the colored school we had for about 10 years. And this is a thing in the paper about some of the kids who had the honor roll. They were all named Lizzie Bowser, Lila Bowser, Edward Hatton Jr., and Adeline Watt. And it was taught by a woman named Fanny Hackett. So it's pretty cool. You know, we go from having nothing. The schools were more or less integrated. We only had a few black kids in the Napa County. And in fact, in St. Helena, Irene Veazey attended the regular St. Helena High School there, because she was the only black child, and so her family was the only black family in St. Helena, so they didn't really have a choice. But in California, you only had to provide a segregated school if there were 10 black children or more. So in Napa County, we had our own school, and it was funded entirely by the black community. Edward Hatton and several of the other men were very big in getting education rights into Napa County. And Edward Hatton's kind of a pretty interesting guy as well. One of my favorite stories about the 2 different churches. So there was a speaker coming up from San Francisco, a white speaker, and everybody was really excited to hear him. So he was going to do a talk at the white church in the morning, and then a talk at the black church in the evening. And the black church at the time is a very small building. It's a small wooden structure. It's not exactly the most stable thing. The thing falls apart within a couple of years later. But he was such a popular speaker that all the African Americans showed up at the white church in the morning to hear him talk, and in the evening, all the white people showed up at the black church to hear him talk. So there's there's definitely some, racial issues and some racial tensions, but things are turning in a much more positive way in the 1870s and 1880s. We're in a good mood, we're in a good place, we're kind of coming together in a way that you wouldn't normally see anywhere else, and you're certainly not seeing it in the South in the 1870s. So what's happening in Napa is very, very interesting at the time. These were some of the early African-American families here. This man down here is Clayton Jones, and he worked at Sawyer Tannery for many years. Up at the top there, right here, that's Irene Vesey. She unfortunately dies a few years after that photo was taken. She died as a child up in St. Helena. And this couple here is Julia Canner and her granddaughter Maisie Barfield. So the Canners are an interesting family. Julia Canner and Paul Canner were brought in from Missouri as slaves in California. They're recorded on the 1860 census. And somehow they get their freedom. I'm not sure if they were freed after the Civil War or if they were able to buy their freedom. It's a little hazy. But they become free, and they remain, their family and their descendants remain in Napa County until 2002. The Canners had a couple of children. Maisie Barfield here worked at the Sunsweet Prune Factory here in town. And if you know the name Wesley Jennings from St. Helena, who's a very popular African-American musician up in St. Helena, built the first radio, probably built the first color television in St. Helena, fought off in World War I. Actually, he tried to register for World War I and then was rejected because he was black and then got drafted anyways. But he and his wife, Ava, who worked at Schramsburg as a nurse before Schramsburg was Schramsburg, or in between Schramsburg being Schramsburg, and they lived up in St. Helena, and they were the longest, part of the longest family, African-American family in Napa County from about 1860 to 2002 when he passed away. And they had no children as far as I can tell. But yeah, so this is the period about the 1900s or so, late 1890s into 1900s, that you start to see that massive downhill slope in African Americans in Napa County. And there's a couple of things happening, and they kind of explain why we have the small African American population that we have today. So about the 1880s, 1890s, you start to see an increase in racial tensions all over the country. Reconstruction is done. Actually, it's dead. It's been killed by replacements in politics. And restoration in the South is king. Jim Crow starts to pick up, and that starts to spread throughout the rest of the United States. In Napa County in particular, there's a very strong, impenetrable glass ceiling. The African Americans in Napa County hit a glass ceiling. All they can do, they can be barbers, they can have skilled trades, they can rent homes. Generally speaking, they lived in an area called Spanish Town, which is where they put all of the Mexicans and all of the Native Americans. It was up about where St. John's is now, and a little bit further north into Pueblo and Lincoln. That's where they kind of clustered all of the brothels and all the brown people. So you could live in Spanish Town, you could rent a home in Spanish Town, you could work a low-paying blue-collar job, and that's about all you could do. So I started tracing some of the families who left Napa. I started following them around in the census records, looking for them to see what they were doing. Almost all of them leave Napa County and go to Solano or San Francisco or anywhere else, and immediately buy a home, and immediately get a well-paying, upper-class job, or a job like a foreman, or an electrician, something that you need education for, something that you need special training for. You don't really need special training to be a barber, it's cutting hair. But you need special training and special education to be an electrician. So almost all of them who leave Napa County go off to do something better, and they couldn't do that here. The other thing you start to see is we had a nice intermarriage of the slaves and the free people. So in after the Civil War, you see a lot of African Americans from the north go into the south and into the west, attempting to sort of colonize in a way. They're trying to bring education to places where African Americans were denied it, and they're trying to set up black communities throughout the west to kind of create welcoming towns for everybody else and kind of spread that racial ease. And that's what happened here in Napa, and of course, after several years of that black ceiling, that first generation starts to die off of old age, and their children don't want anything to do with it. Their children get married and leave. And so all you have left are the Julia Canners. You have the descendants of slaves who are fine working the low-paying jobs, don't seem to mind it. There's no shame on them. But those who wanted more had to leave. So this is one, I'm a big chart person. I was a sociology major, so I like lots of charts. This is one of I think, the most illustrative chart, kind of explaining the shift in African American socioeconomic status from 1852 to 1940. Now, I will say there is no 1950 on there, which would be the key year because that census has not been released yet. But I have a feeling that's going to change for the post-war era. That's going to change a lot of things. I will also add a caveat too that despite the fact that a lot of people say that they were African Americans working at Basalt, I've found no evidence of that. So we'll see. But as you can see, so 1852. You have a lot of domestic servants and laborers. 1860, kind of the same thing, domestic service. 1870, big shift. We've got lots of labor and lots of unskilled trade work and lots of agriculture and viticulture. Remember I mentioned that there were 10 black farmers alone in the Napa County area. One of them was a man named Hiram Grigsby who started out life as a slave brought in by the Grigsby family. And owned property right about where Veterans Home was. So that is prime real estate. He ran a lot of cattle out there. Interestingly enough, he was married 3 times. The first time was while he was a slave, a woman named Patsy Stoke, and he had a couple of kids with her. They were separated when he was brought west. And presumably his wife and his children sold off elsewhere. And then he married a woman here in California. And then after she passed, he married a 3rd woman. After the Civil War, he's part of a group of many African Americans who sent out letters into the newspaper looking for their spouses that they were separated from. And as far as I can tell, he never rekindled with Patsy. Let's see here. So we've got a lot of agriculture, a lot of labor. And again, in 1880, it's about the same. You're starting to see more families in Napa County. You're starting to see education. The slaves that are freed, of course, are completely illiterate, but their children, to a number, are all enrolled in school. They're all literate. Education is very, very, very important for the slaves, even the ones that don't marry into free families. Education is key because they understand that it's been denied and that's why they couldn't move up. So all of their children are in school, one of whom even went to Napa Business College. By 1900, you see this massive drop and this huge increase in unemployment. And that is the trend that continues on more or less all the way through about 1940 or so. Unemployment in African Americans in Napa County and the rest of the United States is always much higher in this period, even during the Great Depression. It was much, much, much higher. The New Deal, which everybody credits to kind of helping to turn around the economy, was intentionally written to exclude African Americans. There's a reason that the New Deal doesn't include domestic service workers and those who could not show continuous employment for 3 to 6 months. Those 2 factors hit the African American community the hardest because they couldn't show continuous employment because a lot of them worked small jobs or odd jobs around, but also most of them were domestic servants, which you see here in 1940. In 1940, all of the 40 or so African Americans in Napa County, with the exception of 2 who were farm laborers, all of them worked in domestic service. They were gardeners, chauffeurs, or nurses. So what you see here is in 1860 and 1940, the socioeconomic rate of African Americans is identical. So we went up, we had our chance, and we hit that glass ceiling, and we went right back down again. And that's actually fairly common throughout the rest of the United States. It's not Napa specific, but Napa fit into that mold pretty well. So again, you've got, even during the Great Depression here, it's African Americans that are being hit the hardest. You can fire your chauffeur, but you're not going to fire your doctor. And because we couldn't be doctors, we got fired off first and we got hired last. And that carries all the way through. So we're into the 1920s and 1930s. As some of you probably know, we had the KKK here in Napa, possibly still do, if you believe the rumors. We had 2 big meetings in Napa County, one in 1923, one in 1924. The one in 23, I think it was, that took place down at the Napa State Hospital, or just outside of Napa State Hospital, and they initiated, I think, 100 men or so, a huge crowd, and then they had another one up in St. Helena on H.J. Llewellyn's property, which is just south of town. And that one had about 10,000 spectators, and they initiated another couple dozen men as well. The one down in Napa State Hospital initiated several sailors from Mare Island, which is interesting to me because there were a lot of African Americans who also worked at Mare Island. So it's kind of a weird situation to be in. The KKK in Napa County tried to play off less the racism and more, we hate bootleggers and we hate Catholics. We don't really hate Catholics and Jews, but we hate Catholics and Jews. That was their big push. Also, they didn't like taxes. But the KKK couldn't get a strong foothold in Napa County. We had meetings until about the mid-1930s or so, which is well after the KKK had already been kind of kicked out by the country, but they never managed to get a real stronghold. Instead, again, this glass ceiling thing, we had a different kind of racism in Napa County, and it's that sense of microaggressions. And that's what this photo is. It's a little hard to see, but the caption of this photo is, it's a parade in Napa, about 1933 or so, and the caption that was written on this photo in our scrapbook from Napa County Historical Society, this was written by the man who had the photo taken in the 30s. The caption is, quote, "Darkies in the dark." Yes. And you can kind of see the two men in the car there, and that's Lovejoy's Drugs right there. Two men in the car have their faces painted black. They are white men in blackface. That's the kind of racism you have. It's very hard to fight microaggression, even today. But that's kind of what we're dealing with. That's, again, that glass ceiling that I'm talking about. It's hard to bring in people. You're also starting to get redlining. Does anybody know what redlining is? You know what redlining is? Check your deeds. If you own a house in Napa that was built prior to the 50s, check your deeds. Because there's a good chance, if it was built in the 40s, that there's going to be an exclusionary clause in there, a restrictive clause, stating, I don't know if you, this. So this is out of a deed that was taken here in Napa. It's still actually in the deed. But this one was from about 1948 or so. No persons other than those wholly of the white Caucasian race shall use, occupy, or reside upon any part of or within any building located in the above described subdivision, except servants or domestics of another race employed by the occupants of any said lot. Yes. That is the product of redlining. It was sanctioned by the US government, the Federal Housing Authority, in 1938. It was run amok with the Realtors Association in 1938 because it was federally sanctioned. There were handbooks explaining how you could exclude people of color. There were the redlining districts. So it's actually a map with a red line around it. And what they have them for San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. And they would evaluate a neighborhood. If there was a single person of color, that neighborhood was automatically rated a D, which excluded it from loans, excluded it from some federal benefits, and just, I mean, thing after thing after thing. And so you start to get this ghettoization of the African American community and the Latino community. And then you also get the exclusion out of the area. One of the interesting things about in Napa County in particular, and this doesn't happen until about the 70s, but throughout the United States, the group of realtors that actually start to resist against this are the Jewish realtors, because they've had experience being stuck in ghettos and not being able to get out. So in Napa County in particular, there were a couple of Jewish realtors here who really resisted the redlining of African Americans in Napa County. There are I mean, you talk to a generation of African Americans who tried to move in here in the 70s and 80s, and even back into the 60s, and they'll tell you stories of not being able to find apartments and not being able to get houses. And there were a couple of Jewish lawyers who really fought back against that and were able to start renting to people. So now we're getting into the 1970s and 1980s. This is actually my mom. She was in the register. She worked at the Queen, and she was also a pilot out at the airport, so she's pretty awesome. So in the 1970s, you start to see what's called the Second Great Migration in the United States. So the first Great Migration happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as African Americans fled the South or attempted to flee the South during after the Civil War. And then you have a little bit of it again during the Great Depression. A lot of African Americans leave the South during the Great Depression trying to get out and find better jobs, and especially in the post-war era where everybody leaves. But in particular, starting in the 1970s, there's a second Great Migration of African Americans leaving the South and coming west, or leaving the East and coming west, in my mom's case. She's actually from Connecticut. And what they're doing is they're not taking low-paying jobs, they're not taking low-skill jobs, they're taking white-collar jobs. So again, my mom, as a prime example, got a master's degree in medical technology and came west and worked at the Queen. She was a well-paid professional at the Queen. So she's not doing low-paying jobs, and that's what you start to see in Napa County. It's that sense of letting in a select few who represent black exceptionalism. They're not the riffraff, they're not the unwanted, they're not the low-educated. The ones that are moving into Napa County and areas like Napa County are considered acceptable because they have education, they don't act black. Look at me. They don't, they don't fit the stereotypes necessarily, so to speak. So that's that shift in that you start to see here in Napa County, and it's interesting. It's an interesting dynamic. The African Americans that were here again in the late 1800s, they were attempting to that sense of assimilating in, and those who just accepted things as they were and didn't resist against that were the ones that were able to stay, and the ones that were like, sure, this is fine. The ones that had issues with that found that they either couldn't fight it or didn't want to resist it and left for where it was easier. And it's kind of a similar shift now, where we start to see those coming, people coming in and are like, this is nice. This is, there's good education, there's nice housing. Housing was more affordable in the 70s than it is today. So it's a different dynamic, but now we're getting to my generation who's like, well, no, there's some issues here that we need to talk about, we need to have this conversation about. Because not everything is working the way, we might want it to work. There are still microaggressions, there's still things that are happening that are keeping not just African Americans, but people of all colors and all gender identities and sexual orientations that are kind of hitting that glass ceiling. And we need to talk about that glass ceiling. And I have no idea what my time is. Am I okay? All right. I don't think I have another slide, do I? Oh yeah, just the last little chart. This is the last thing. You can see the percentages of the increase in African Americans over the years, and the other general races as well. You can see we definitely get more black as time goes on. There are 2,000 of us now in the county. Yay!
Thank you. I'm sure you have lots of questions. Hold them. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Omar Saline. He's a police officer here in Napa. He's also Muslim, and he has some wisdom to share with us. Officer Saline. And we're also happy to have the senior Mr. Salim here with us too, his father.
Can I ask her questions, or do we have to wait till the end? Because that was great.
Ask the judge.
Yeah. I always, kind of look at the crowd before when I get introduced as a police officer, and I always say I'm sorry if I, had a contact with you and it wasn't that great. Just for tonight, if we could put that aside and have a good conversation. I'm a Muslim, and I also grew up in Napa County. And I think reflecting back on the video that we watched initially, talking about race and race matters and marginalization, my parents are of Arab descent, and when I was born in this country, and when I went to school, my parents separated when I was 5, and my father remarried my stepmother, who was Mexican, so I speak fluent Spanish, and I grew up in a household, and I have, a lot of the Latino/Catholic values. Even though my father was Muslim and my stepmother was Catholic, I went to St. John's Catholic and immersed myself in that tradition and continued to learn. But growing up in school, the system, I could never even, it was like white, non-white, Pacific Islander, Latino, Hispanic, African American, but I never had Middle Eastern or Arab, and I always struggled with my own personal identity of who I was. I just said Latino, I fit, and that's where I, put myself in. And then, that kind of had an effect on me personally because, I understand a lot of Arabic. I don't speak it fluently, but I got away from speaking Arabic and I lost my language because I felt that it wasn't acceptable. I remember my auntie she worked for YMCA in San Francisco, and she's blind, and she would take me on BART, and we would go from Concord to San Francisco and back, and she'd always talk to me in Arabic, and she'd speak loud. And I'm looking around the station, everybody's looking at me and looking at her, and I'm like, Auntie, stop, don't talk in Arabic, you're gonna kick us off. And she said no, and she continued to talk in Arabic. She goes, don't lose your language. And unfortunately, I didn't really listen to her, and I just went away from that. So I wanted to put that out there because we're talking about race. I was asked to talk about Islam and what Islam is. And there's a lot of misconceptions that are out there. And I just want to just talk briefly and leave it for the questions, because I think it's when we start asking questions is where the important conversation comes out, is what is Islam and what do we believe in? And, there's a beautiful hadith, which is the saying of the Prophet that talks about our tradition. And as Muslims, we believe we're the children of the Abrahamic faiths, right? We believe in, first and foremost, in the God. Many people have a misconception when we say, Muslims believe in Allah. And Allah is really kind of like, well, who is Allah? Is that a moon god? Is that a sun god? Is that some other god? It's actually an Arabic word. That means God in English. So the same way you would say Dios is God, Allah is Arabic for God. And it's very an interesting word because when you say Allah, it's actually contraction, expansion of your tongue. So the word that we refer to God in Islam is Allah. So we believe in God. We also believe in all of the prophets that God sent, from Adam all the way down to what we believe to be the last prophet, Muhammad, which his revelation came about 1400 years ago, through Jesus, through Moses, through Abraham. We believe in them, and we believe in Jesus, and we believe in Moses, and we share a lot of the beliefs of the Abrahamic faiths. We also believe in a day of judgment, that it will come to pass, a day of judgment, and that heaven is not just for Muslims or just for Jews or just for Christians, but it's up to God who He lets into heaven and who goes into hell. And just to tap back into the race thing, for me, when I was 18 years old, I had an identity crisis, and I needed to really find out more about my faith. And I asked my father, I said, hey, I want to go to Mecca. I want to really know what Islam is about, because I'm getting misconceptions of what it is. So I had a good friend take me for a month, and we came back, and I had no idea who Malcolm X was or what his story was about. And I ended up reading his autobiography when he came back. And Malcolm X, if any of you know his story, grew up in a time where there was a lot of civil rights issues. I believe that he had his civil rights in the North while Dr. King was in the South. And many times Malcolm's story gets eclipsed by Dr. King. And Malcolm was Muslim. He was a black Muslim, and he was part of the Nation of Islam when he converted, when he was in jail, and then he ended up, through the nation saw some, misguided thinking, and really for himself, he's like, I want to learn about Islam, and ends up going to Mecca. And he writes this beautiful letter to his wife. I didn't bring it, I think it's very relevant now that I'm hearing the conversation, but a beautiful letter that he writes to his wife, and talks to her about what he sees, that Islam actually brought together whites, Asians, blacks, and that there was no, you're over there, I'm over here. And when he came back, he actually changed his name from Malcolm X to Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, and that's what's on his headstone on his grave, is that name. And I really recommend, if you really want to understand the Muslim identity in America, especially with civil rights, the story of Malcolm X is a beautiful story, where we see how Islam actually transformed him. Malcolm is a very genuine, beautiful person who always sought the truth, even if it was against himself. So I just want to bring Malcolm X in honor of race and to bring his story. Another, a misconception that a lot of people have, and I want to talk about the misconceptions, I was asked to talk about them, is about women in Islam, of how women are treated. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and one of them that women are treated lowly. And if you look at our religious tradition, in many examples, you know, when the Prophet Muhammad received his first revelation, he ran to his wife. He ran to his wife Khadija. And in his life we have an example. So as Muslims, we look at the Quran as our text from God, or the word from God, and then how did the Prophet Muhammad live his life? So if you look at his life and how he treated his women, it's a total different idea of what many misconceptions are. So going back, once he received revelation, he became very fearful. He thought he was possessed and something had occurred to him, so he ran to his wife. Right? So there is an example. If things for men aren't going well, go to your wives. They'll guide you, ground you. I have a wife, so that's who I go to, and sometimes I don't want to because I know she's going to tell me the truth and I don't want to hear it. So in that is example. Second, the leading scholar of our tradition, you know, after the Prophet Muhammad's passing is his, because Khadija was his first wife, she passed, he later marries Aisha, and she becomes the leading scholar for hadith, meaning the narration of the Prophet, the words he said, and she was a woman. And there was men who sat at her feet and listened to what she had to say. And speaking about Aisha and the idea of terrorism in Islam and that, you know, Muslims should go fight and Muslims should go kill, if that's what the Prophet wanted, he would die that way. But if you read his story, he actually died in his hands of his wife, you know, next to her, being comforted by her. So we have that story amongst them. We also have the story, which I mentioned many times, is the story of Miriam, the mother of Jesus. And if you read the Quran, there's a chapter in the Quran called Surah al-Maryam, the chapter of Miriam. And we believe the Quran to be the Word of God. Even the names of the chapters are the Word of God. And to be named the chapter of Miriam is actually very weighty. So there's a chapter called Miriam, and then throughout the Quran, all the prophets are mentioned by name. Moses is Musa, Moses is Musa, Abraham is Ibrahim, you know, Yusuf is Joseph. And then there's Jesus comes along in the Quran, and all his name throughout, beginning to the end, is Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus the son of Mary. And he's continued to be referred to as Jesus the son of Mary. And that's two things. One, because he's a prophet of God, him being named Jesus, but his elevation, also his plus, is that he's the son of Mary. He gets exalted by being the son of Mary. And we believe that Miriam is an example for all our women in Islam. And if you look at pictures of Mary, whether it be in the Catholic tradition or anywhere, she's veiled, she's covered. And I just wanted to say that Miriam is being an example because many misconceptions is that women are oppressed and they have to cover themselves as something that they're forced to do. And that's not the case. Women have a right to be covered or not covered, and it's all amongst modesty. Yes, there are maybe 2 or 3 countries that impose some sort of religious police law where women are to be covered, but that is nowhere within the tradition. Each person is with their own relationship with God. I want to keep it short with my time. I just wanted to say just one thing. There's a lot of beautiful things in our tradition, and hopefully we can bring some of that conversation out. And I found it very interesting what Alexandria said, that in Spanish Town, you know, they had put the blacks with the brothels. And, you know, there's a beautiful story in our tradition where, you know, women or anyone who was found to be either, you know, committed drinking or alcoholics, or there was one woman who she was a prostitute, and they found out she was a prostitute. They actually took her and put her in the residential district with the scholars so she can be rectified, right? And that's a gem in our tradition. And if you look of 900 years of Muslims in Spain, and, you know, I had the privilege of visiting Spain and southern Spain, that the Muslims gave up their palaces. They didn't want to fight. They didn't know how to fight. They lived in peace. And when they came and commenced the Crusades, they gave it up. They walked away from it. And they just said, please don't destroy the Alhambra. Please don't destroy the Cordoba Mosque. So there's a lot of, you know, beautiful stories in our tradition that I think we can all, you know, gather from. And more recently, if we look at the life of the life of Malcolm X. And I'll close with this. And I've read this before, and I think it's important to read. Our Prophet Muhammad gave a farewell speech, and it was his last speech that he gave his people, and I think it's relevant to share it, and I'll end with this. He said, "O people, lend me an attentive ear, for I know not whether after this year I shall ever be amongst you again." Therefore, listen to what I'm saying to you very carefully and take these words to those who could not be present here today. O people, just as you regard this month, this day, this city as sacred, so regard the life and property of every Muslim as a sacred trust. Return the goods entrusted to you to their rightful owners. Hurt no one so that no one may hurt you. Remember that you will indeed meet your Lord, and that he will indeed reckon your deeds. God has forbidden you to take interest. Therefore, all interest obligation shall now be waived. Your capital, however, is yours to keep. You will neither inflict nor suffer any iniquity. God has judged that there be no interest, and that all the interest due to Abbas, which was a family of the Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle, shall be waived. He said, beware of Satan for the safety of your religion. He has lost all hope that he will ever be able to lead you astray in big things, so be aware of following him in small things. O people, it is true that you have certain rights with regard to your women, but they also have rights over you. Remember that you have taken them as your wives only under God's trust and with his permission. If they obey by a right, then them belongs the right to be fed and clothed in kindness. Do treat your women well and be kind to them, for they are your partners and committed helpers. And it is your right that they do not make friends with anyone of whom you would not approve, and they should keep their modesty. O people, listen to me in earnest and worship God. Say your 5 daily prayers, fast during the month of Ramadan, give your wealth in charity, and if you can perform the Hajj to Mecca, if you can afford to, do it. All mankind is from Adam and Eve, and an Arab, this is 1400 years ago, and an Arab has no superiority over a non-Arab, nor a non-Arab has a superiority over an Arab. Also a white has no superiority over a black, nor a black any superiority over a white, except in piety and good action. Learn that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, and that Muslims constitute one brotherhood. Nothing shall be legitimate to a Muslim which belongs to a fellow Muslim unless it was given freely and willingly. Do not, therefore, do injustice to yourselves. Remember, one day you will appear before God and answer your deeds, so beware to not stay away from the path of righteousness after I am gone. O people, no prophet or apostle will come after me, and no new faith will be reborn. Reason well. Therefore, O people, understand these words which I convey to you. I leave behind me two things, the Quran and my example. And if you follow these two, you will never go astray. All those who listen to me shall pass on my words to others, and those to others again. And may the last ones understand my words better than the ones who listen to me directly. Be my witness, O God, that I've conveyed my message, your message to your people.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Charlie Toledo. Ms. Toledo is the Executive Director of the Suscol Intertribal Council of the Napa Valley. We're very delighted to have her come. She's a woman of history, contemporary issues, and a very wise woman. Very wise.
I want to thank everybody for coming out on a weeknight. I know how difficult it is to free ourselves from our daily schedules. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'll apologize if I offend anybody in any way. We always start our talks like that, especially me. So we usually offer a song when we start. We, as Native people, we come into a new area with new people, we always offer gifts. So this song is a song to help you remember where you were before you were in this lifetime, in this body. It's your star song from when your spirit descended to this earthly plane. It's just part of helping you to remember that you're an infinite being of light that continues beyond this lifetime and existed before this expression. So I'm asking you to open your heart, and the things we're talking about are difficult. One of my friends, one of my elder advisors told me long ago that people don't know what they don't know. So I always have a difficult position of telling people what they don't know. And unfortunately, most racism is based in ignorance. So the solution for that then is education, information, exposure to something other than you. So unless you get into places where you're uncomfortable, you're not really learning what you don't know. So I hope to make you very uncomfortable in the next 5 minutes. I'll try to make it easy, but I'm going to ask you a few questions just to start a base of what you don't know. How many native tribes existed in what is now referred to as the United States pre-colonial invasion? You don't have to raise your hand, we're not in school. Just yell it out, we're all adults. Hundreds. Good. Some people say 500. 500 different tribes existed pre-colonial invasion. How many tribes existed in California before the Europeans invaded here? 50, 500, 300. And I notice all of you that aren't answering, I'm assuming you don't know. So what defines one tribe from another? We've determined there were 500 tribes pre-colonial, 300 different tribes in California. So what defines one tribe from another tribe in indigenous populations? Language? Oh, you guys, no, I'm not going to be able to show you what you don't know. It's language. Language is the key, and that's what creates one tribe. So there were over 300 different tribes in California, 300 different languages spoken here by the indigenous populations. In Napa, living in Napa pre-1850s, because we're not talking ancient history here, we're talking 1800s, when the Europeans invaded and began the mass slaughter of the indigenous populations that were here. We're not discovering a wilderness. General Vallejo and Junipero Serra did not discover anything. They invaded a land that was fully populated. For how long? How long was California, Northern California, Napa Valley populated? 60,000 years. Indigenous people lived here. And if there were 300 languages, does that indicate complexity?
Yes.
Very complex societies. Now I challenge you in the next few days to do your research. Some of you already have because you know answers to my questions, which rarely people do, so I'm like, yay! How long did it take that transition from a complex, civilized people to be nearly wiped out? 25 years in Napa Valley. Now, when you go to research, to read about it, to look it up, unless you go to Google in the unprinted, unpublished work, it's very hard to find a book that talks about indigenous people. The myth of the indigenous people is that people were wandering about, and then when the Europeans discovered this beautiful place, they moved north because they were camping. They were in camps. The written word of indigenous people is they lived in camps. People don't camp for 60,000 years. People were living in complex villages. The population of Napa, pre-colonial times, was over 40,000 people were living here in Napa County. Napa is one of the oldest inhabited places in North America. And that population of fully civilized, generous, kind people was nearly wiped out in less than 25 years. And we hear about the long walk that the Cherokee did in Oklahoma. That's about all you hear in elementary school. The long walk. Over there, they made him walk a really long way. And a long walk always sounds so poetic, you know, a walk, you know, you go on a walk, it's fun. Get to camp, get to eat around the fire. What the relocations here are referred to as bloody runs. How many of you heard of the bloody runs? That's because you guys know me. No, somebody who doesn't know me. No, how many of you ever heard of the bloody runs out of Napa Valley? How many were there? How many bloody runs? Rounding up the indigenous people after they were nearly massacred, and the survivors were women, babies, elders, and children, were run by people on horseback 3 separate times out of Napa Valley. The reason they're called bloody runs is because they were being run by people on horseback. And the people who survived to get to those remote locations where they were being pushed to, run to, killed to get there were teenagers. So the survivors of California native complex populations were teenagers who had been severely traumatized. So when people ask me, well, why are the people, Indians, fighting so much? Well, I don't think they should have, because, you know, where did they come from? I don't think they're really the tribe. Excuse me. And I talk to elementary school kids all the time, and I always ask them, how long do you think it would take if somebody came in here, killed your parents, killed your teachers, burned down your church and your school, and they go, yay, to burn down the school, burned your house, and then made you run 100 to 300 miles from here? How long do you think it would take you to find your way home? How long would it take you? How long would it take your children if that happened to them? 3 generations. And what we're seeing in California right now is the 3rd generation, in early stages of recovery from a very severe trauma. Trauma so severe is embedded into the DNA. You know, a friend of mine working for Oakland Indian Friendship House recently did her PhD, and her dissertation was in that, you know, that enzyme, that DNA marker that is a weakness, why Native Americans are drunk. They drink so much, they don't have a resistance to alcohol. They don't, it's in their DNA, right? So she's saying to doctors, show me the marker. You know, all those DNAs, the chromosomes are all marked. And what they have and what they do, that's all marked. Show me the marker, the DNA marker in the indigenous bloodlines that's that weakness to alcoholism. It doesn't exist. That's not true. There's no such thing. It's a myth. It's a story. It's a story to make a people that were so deeply traumatized, so traumatized that they can't move. They can't recover. I was giving a talk at Stanford once about, you know, the whole colonization, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you know, when people are under this really big, heavy rock, they kind of have this idea that somebody's going to come and take it off of them. And then you start to realize, oh, nobody's coming. Help is not on the way. So you have to kind of wake up and help yourself. And it's very, very difficult to do in a society that's systemically, currently attempting to wipe out not just you, not just your bloodline, not just your children's children, but the memory of you. The memory of you is not allowed. Now, how traumatic is that? And then you have to kind of come out from under the rug. And everybody says, why are you so dirty? God, you guys are so dirty. Why are you so drunk all the time? God, you guys are vitalized. So that's just the beginning. That's barely the touch. That's barely the tip of what you don't know. The story is a very long story. Most of the story, the 60,000 year story, is a beautiful, amazing story. full of wonder, full of love, full of beauty. Now, why would we not allow that story to be told? Why would I, in 1992, when I'm reorganizing the Suscol Intertribal Council, local Native American organization founded in 1972 by some of the elders who had oral tradition of what happened here, why would suddenly helicopters start following me around? Why would my phone be tapped? Why would the police be going after my children who were in elementary school? You know, that's a pretty big shut up. And I can tell those stories and people can think I'm making them up. I've been told many times, you're making that up. You're lying. I realized, wow, these people are serious about, me shutting up. But fortunately, I had a mother who always wanted me to shut up, and it didn't work, so lots of practice. And I realized that what was happening in California, what was happening in Napa Valley, what was happening in the United States, was the government wanted this like that. So I thought, oh, we have to go out into the big world. We gotta go to the UN, we gotta go to international conferences. And then we found out that, oh, this is happening to Indigenous people around the world. The same thing, the same suppression, the same wipe out of the memory. The name shall not be spoken. The words shall not be put in one sentence. Civilized human beings living in complex societies, living in sustainable, ongoing, green, safe environments. Don't put all those words together. That's wrong. And if you try to do that, we will try to kill you. And in the 60s and 70s, when Native people were starting to organize out of this same county, Napa Valley, they were being threatened. Different people that they were working with, their hands were being cut off and sent back to their families. And if you talk about that your child has disappeared, this will happen to you. How many of you guys have read about that? It was in 1971, 1972, all the way through 1980. Jim Big Bear King, who is the founder of Suscol Intertribal Council, when he stood up to stand and to stop the desecration of a large village site, Suscol Village, just with the Southern Crossing, he said somebody would threaten to shoot him or kill him at least once a week. If somebody didn't point a gun at him, at least once a week, he felt like he wasn't working hard enough. And he was my mentor, when I decided to stand up and remember that what had happened to my grandparents and my children and my grandparents and my parents. Unspoken stories, and my grandparents and my great aunts were saying, where is she getting this information? Nobody talks about that. And my sister, trying to save me, said, well, she dreams. She dreams it. And I did mostly dream it, because we do have, many people from many races have that capacity for a deep memory. So the dreams I was having were based in facts of what happened to my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my great-great-grandparents. It was my great-grandmother was taken as a slave as a baby, because babies are way easier to handle. So how they traumatized and how, unfortunately, Indigenous people are being traumatized right now in Central America and South America and Papua New Guinea is they take the children. Because when you take a child from a family, it immobilizes the family. And that's what was done here in California. As late as, what do you think? Let's guess. When was the last time the FBI broke into people's homes, put guns to children's heads, took out all the males over the age of 18, down to Ukiah for questioning? When was the last time that happened in Northern California? 1995. 1995, not so long ago. So I'm going to leave you with that. I want to offer that we are still standing, that there are people indigenous to this community. This is the only ethnic group of people that have to prove their ethnicity with a card, and a number on it, that the government keeps track of. who you are, where you live, how many children you have, and what you do for work. Government keeps track of. That's what's called a federally recognized Indian. And I give a regular 45-minute to 2-hour presentation, but I'm staying to 10 minutes today, hoping that you'll get curious, that you'll want to know more, that you'll say, how come I don't know this? That's the question I always ask people, how come you don't know these things? That's not an accident. It's not because you didn't want to know.